Hi guys, welcome to the Comic Book Writer. I'm B. Claymore and I'm a comic book writer. And what we're going to do on this channel is talk about comic book writing. Hopefully anything related to comic book writing, comic book creation, the industry as a whole. I've been in the industry for 15 years, so I'll do my best to kind of give you my perspective on things. Along the way, we'll talk to other writers, artists, letters, colorists, fans, editors, anybody involved in the industry, and try to get a different perspective on things. If you've got any suggestions or anything you're curious about or stuff you want to hear about, go ahead and let me know, and I'll do my best to get to that. If you like the channel, subscribe. If you don't. And hopefully along the way, we'll both learn something. Okay, so the first thing I want to do here, just as a kind of basic primer, is to discuss the different types of comic books you can write. This mainly relates to ownership, compensation, and publication. And I've got a stack here of a few books I've written over the years. I'm not great at keeping single issues of books I've written on hand. After a certain point, when you've got the second issue of a three-part story, there's not much you can do with it. But this pile does kind of represent the different types of things I've written for different publishers. Let's start with the first thing I ever did was a book called Love in Tights, Slave Labor Graphics. This is an anthology, indie press, not much money to be made, contributions from a variety of independent creators. Every story in here, every character owned completely by the people who contributed the stories. Why would you do a book like this? Tell the stories you want to tell, get your stories out there, some exposure. And in the case of this lead story is a story I did with Kalman Androsovsky about a character I created called The Midnight Hour. And eventually, The Midnight Hour is a character who worked his way into a book I did at Image Comics with Jeremy Hahn called Battle Hymn, but I kind of established the character here. So, first thing I ever did, learned how to network, learned how the industry worked, learned how to collect a variety of files, assemble them in a comic book, write solicitation copy and previews. That's your basic anthology. This is another one from Image Comics. Eric Larson created this book. Next issue, I can't remember what the name it was. Whatever. The idea behind this series was to take a Golden Age series and publish what would have been the next issue. So the last issue of Crack Comics back in the 40s was number 62. This would have been 63. Again, these are public domain characters, so you don't own the characters, but you do own the stories you created using the characters. In my case, I used a character called the Red Torpedo, who eventually was owned. DC acquired the rights to the Red Torpedo, so if I'm going to do a Red Torpedo story, which I did, I can only use the public domain stories as a starting point for what I did. So that's what I did. It's kind of a postmodern thing that Frank Fosco and Eric Larson did the art and color on. And again, I own the rights to this story. The Red Torpedo is public domain, so I can't own the character. No money involved here. If the book had made a bunch of money, it would have been split evenly between the creators, but it was a lot of fun to do. Next up are completely creator-owned books, in this case from Image Comics. Hawaiian Dick was a completely creator-owned book. 76, book that I did half of with Ed Tatum, a character called Jackie Karma. We own all the rights to. After a flat fee that Image collects, all the profits from the book go directly to the creators. The second half of the book was by Seth Peck and Ty Walker. It was called Cool, so they own the rights to that. Not just the rights to the character, all the profits, but if we ever wanted to do something with these characters with another publisher or in other media, we have the complete freedom to do that. Image Comics doesn't actually own any intellectual property except for the Image Eye. Beyond that, everything is owned by the creators completely, and the creators have the freedom to do what they want with them. And that's down to editorial. I mean, we had no input from Image in terms of content or editorial or anything like that once the book was approved. So that's the case with these books. Battle Hymn, another book that Jeremy and I did at Image, same thing. And I've done a few books at Image. It's the only place I've ever worked where I literally own all the rights to everything we do, and there are definite advantages to that. Then we come to straight work for hire. A couple examples here. It's a Wildcat story Ramon Perez and I did at DC, a three-part story. Actually had to talk DC into Ramon working on this story, but covers by Sean Chen. But Ramon did some fantastic work with some amazing color by Dave McCaig. Obviously, DC owns the rights to Wildcat, Catwoman, any of the characters in here. Any characters we created or introduced are also owned by DC. Same with Marvel. This is a Black Widow, Phantom X story I did a few years ago with Christopher Anka. Get my page rate. I have a set page rate for both these companies, so I make that amount per page. The books sell a certain amount. I would theoretically make royalties, but mainly you're doing this for the page rate and just for the enjoyment of working with characters that you love. Same thing with this. I just picked this trade up at a convention this weekend. I didn't actually know it existed, but Bloodshot. It's a one-shot Bloodshot standalone story I did a couple years ago. Again, Valiant owns Bloodshot. I make my page rate. The book sells beyond a certain level. I make royalties off of that. Down the road, I did more for Valiant, but this is straight work for hire. They own all of this. Now, this is also technically work for hire, which means I make my page rate, but in this case, I created this character, Savage, along with artists Louis LaRosa and Clayton Henry. Specifically Louis LaRosa. Louis did the design work. So, even though I conceived and created the character in the story with editorial guidance, it's a character that is owned by Valiant. So I make my page rate on this book, and if anything is done in the future with the character, I have what is called equity in the character. As a creator, I would receive a percentage of the profits based on that equity. Same for this book, which is something I did for DC several years ago, Casey Blue, Beyond Tomorrow. Conceived and created the character for editor Ben Abernathy with his guidance. Published this 6-issue miniseries. Again, DC owns all the rights to the character, but in the event of, say, media or other exploitation of the character, I would earn a percentage based on being the creator with character equity involved. From there, it's a book Tony Harris and I did at DC. This is an odd one. I don't know of anything else like this. I mean, there have been a couple examples, but this was a character that we had pitched to Wildstorm/DC. It had been approved. The Whistling Skull. The original title was The Further Adventures of the Whistling Skull and Knuckles. But when Wildstorm collapsed, we moved it over to DC proper, and after I'd already written all 6 issues, Tony suggested we incorporate JSA Liberty Files characters in there, which are characters that Tony had co-created several years earlier based on the DC Justice Society. And to my surprise, Dan DiDio, Jim Lee, DC, said, sure, go ahead and throw those characters in. Which means, and in fact, this issue leads off with our take on the Boy Commandos, which is a old Simon and Kirby group of characters from the 40s. Had it just been the Whistling Skull, what would have happened here is that DC would have had the rights to the book until it had been out of publication for a certain amount of time, at which point the rights could have reverted back to Tony and I, in which case we could have done whatever we wanted with the material. That happened most recently with Jason Aaron's book, The Other Side, that he and Cameron Stewart did at Vertigo. The rights have recently reverted to them, and they've republished it in a sort of custom edition at Image Comics. That is not going to be the case here, because if the rights to the character revert back to us, we have incorporated these characters that are actually owned by DC into the book. So obviously we can't reprint the book as is without eliminating those DC characters. So, in a sense, we kind of painted ourselves into a corner that way, but it did add some depth to the book, and I love the Justice Society characters. So, if the rights ever do get back to us, I guess we'll work around that and figure out what we're going to do. But it is a character we'd like to do more with. Having said that, it's definitely an unusual situation. Now, this is an interesting one. This is I've done a lot of work for DC over the years in what we'd call special projects. Basically, they're advertising supplements. This particular one was for Con Edison, and what Con Edison had asked me to do was create a superhero that they could use to help teach about electrical safety. This is the 3rd Justice League book that I'd actually done for Con Edison. This is the first one that they actually printed, though. It was a giveaway, I think, up in, I assume, New York. And Jolts is this character that I created along with Luciano Vecchio, who did the design work on the character. Actually, it's a pretty cool character. I I don't even know what the ownership of the character would be. I think it'd be cool if we'd see her pop up in DC books. But I've done a lot of these. This was, as I said, for Con Edison. I did a giveaway for the NBA All-Star game that started the Justice League with the Inside the NBA crew, which would have included Shaquille O'Neal, Charles Barkley, Ernie Johnson. I've done Gatorade comics with Dwayne Wade and comics that advertise TV shows and what have you. So there's a wing of DC that specializes in that kind of stuff. And the public doesn't see it often unless it's inserted into a comic book or given away. But it's fun to do. A little different from anything else, and every now and then at a convention someone will show up with one of these books that I wasn't aware anybody had seen. But in this case, again, I make a page rate based on the project and their budget, and once it's published, hopefully they send me a copy or two and something I can put on the shelf. More basic work for hire, Max Steel. I did a couple things, all ages things for Viz. Max Steel, I did a Ben 10 thing. Same thing here. In this case, anything I create in here is owned by the company, and I receive a basic page rate. But these are kind of fun. I've seen these pop up at Scholastic book fairs and here and there and in the library. So it's one of the things you kind of forget you've done until you cross paths with it out in the wild, so to speak. And again, this is an anthology. This is something that Boom had published as a benefit for Josh Medors when he was sick. Mark Waid was sort of like in charge of editorial at Boom at the time, and Seth Peck and Chris Somney and I had this character we created called Blue Jacket, and we didn't really have a home for it. We kind of created this intro story, and Mark said, hey, if you guys want to publish this, establish ownership of it in this Boom anthology, you can do that. You won't get paid, but we won't take any of the rights, and it will exist out in the wild, so to speak. So we did. And to date, this is literally the only thing we've done with this character, but it was a lot of fun, and it was fun to see it in print. And we did put together a separate contract just to kind of verify that Boom would hold no ownership to the character or the story or publication rights beyond this initial issue. And as you can see, it was a short story. Pretty cool Ben Templesmith cover. Ben and I later on did something for DC that was originally published digitally, a Batman story, and was then printed in, actually printed in a single issue and a trade paperback. I don't think I have any copies of that, but that's kind of another way things work. I've done a couple of digital first stories that would then go to print. One with Superman, one with Batman, and actually a licensed series of Vampire Diaries stories. So anyway, hopefully that kind of gives you an indication of some of the variety of different ways things get published, paid for. As you can see, I've created a lot of characters, some of which I own, some of which I don't own, some of which I own a piece of. But for me personally, I get the most satisfaction from creating original characters. So regardless of how it's done, I've enjoyed that process. Whether I own the characters, whether DC owns the characters, whether Valiant owns the characters, just kind of knowing that you've put your stamp on something original is always satisfying. So anyway, hopefully you learned something from that. Let me know if you did, if you didn't, and like I said, let me know what you'd like to hear about next. I'll probably do another video tomorrow with some thoughts maybe on a specific comic book that I've done, maybe talk a little bit more about the process that I use to write comics. And if you like, subscribe. If you don't, and I hope to hear from you soon.